My name's Catherine McAllister. I'm from Adelshaw Goddard, and I'm joined by Susie Dakin from Travers and Rowan Howard from Slaughter and May. Also want to say a big thank you to Chris Widdowson from Travers, who you can't see but has been extremely helpful in helping us with all our practices and will be operating the slides for us in the background. So thank you very much, Chris. I should mention that we hope that we are recording the proceedings today. Shouldn't make a big difference for those of you attending because you can't be seen or heard, but I do have to tell you that we're planning to record. I wanted, as a preliminary point, to make it very clear that although Susie, Rowan and I are all on one or more of the HMRC working group, the industry working group and the APL LMP committee, what we have to say today is very much our own views and should not be taken to be the views of any one or more of those organisations. Contrary to the usual approach in APL lectures, we are going to have a fairly limited amount of time today for questions. We have prepared an entire hour of content. We will, though, be looking at the Q&A feed, and we will very much try to answer questions if we can fit them in. If we don't have time to get to your questions, though, we will give some consideration to whether that might lead on to a further workshop or whether we can get it incorporated in any of the industry-wide guidance. So please do submit any questions that you have, and please don't be offended if we don't get to them in the limited time we have available this afternoon. So the agenda for today's talk is up on the slide now. We're going to do a very quick reminder of what we're all here for, GMP Equalisation. Then we're going to go to Susie for an understanding of the tax framework. And then Susie and Rowan are going to help us apply the framework when trustees are equalising benefits, looking at the lifetime allowance, the annual allowance and fixed protection. And then back to me for a final wind up, looking at the tax implications for lump sums. So this is a quick reminder of why we're all here. The top two boxes remind us why GMPs are unequal between men and women. So as we know, GMPs are generally higher for females because they build up GMP more quickly. And that's because back in the day, women were thought to have shorter working lives and had a GMP age of 60, whereas men had a GMP age of 65. Now, there is, as we all know, overriding legislation that says the aggregate pension from the scheme has to be equalised. But the two boxes in the bottom explain why, nevertheless, we still end up with unequalised pensions when they come into payment. First, we have the fact that pre-retirement increases or revaluation is different between GMP and other benefits. So that means that inequalities can creep in whenever a member has a period of deferment between leaving pensionable service and his pension starting. And then that's compounded again by the fact that increases in payment are different between GMP and other benefits. So once the pensions come into payment, further inequalities can creep in. So with that quick reminder, I'll pass you over to Susie to give you an introduction to the basics of the tax regime.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to start with a very quick reminder of some key tax concepts. They'll be familiar to most of you, so I'm going to cover them quite quickly. There are two regimes we need to think about, which we're going to cover tonight. The lifetime allowance, so that's the limit on the total value of pension savings that a person can accrue over their lifetime, to which the favourable tax regime applies. It's tested when a member takes their pension benefits, and if the member's benefits exceed the lifetime allowance, then that excess is taxed through the application of an LTA charge. Compared to the annual allowance, that's the limit on the pension savings that a member can accrue in any single tax year on a tax favourable basis. And that's tested at the end of each tax year by reference to the accrual over that year. And there's an AA charge payable to the extent that the savings in that tax year exceed the AA. Now, the second key concept for DB pensions tax is the importance of the P. So that is the rate of pension which is payable to a member at the point of retirement. And this concept, we're going to talk about it quite a lot. It features in both the lifetime allowance and the annual allowance rules. Now, when you're looking at lifetime allowance, of course, you can see what the actual pension is that is paid to the member. For annual allowance, it's a bit more complicated. It's the same concept, but because the member hasn't actually retired, it's based on the assumed rate of pension that would be payable to the member at retirement using a set of valuation assumptions. So effectively, you assume the members become entitled at that point to their pension as if it was their NRD, so there's no early retirement reduction. You effectively look at the revaluation accrued at that point. So that's why GMP equalisation causes some LTA and AA issues or complexities to think about, because it's changing the actual, or for AA assumed, rate of pension that is going to be paid to the member. So I'm going to move on and look at some of the LTA issues that arise from GMP equalisation. I'm going to have to fill in a bit more colour about the regime itself. So firstly, a point to remember is that the LTA is different for different people at different times. Either the standard LTA will apply, but that itself varies over time, and it's moved about quite a bit, broadly in a bit of a U shape since it was introduced. It's currently just over 1 million, but it has been as high as 1.8 million. But then some people might have an individual LTA because they are entitled to one of the many forms and types of tax protection that have been made available over the years, which would give a member an LTA which is different from the standard LTA. Now, the way in which you use up your LTA is through benefit crystallisation events. They're events which are set out in the Finance Act, and there will be a prescribed method in the Finance Act for how a benefit event is effectively translated into a capital value to test against the LTA. Once you've used up your LTA, as I just explained, there will be an LTA charge. Trustees and the member have joint and several liability for an LTA charge if it arises. And typically the way of dealing with this is that trustees will normally deduct the charge from the benefits which are coming into payment. So if it's a lump sum, it's normally just a pound for pound deduction. If it's a pension that's caused an LTA charge to arise, then it's normally dealt with by an actuarial adjustment to that pension. But what you can't do is you can't deduct an LTA charge from a pension which is already in payment. So moving on to GMP equalisation adjustments, what of those BCEs are going to be most relevant and we have to think about? Well, I put the 3 core BCEs on this slide. The first one is a BCE2. So that's the scheme pension, that P that comes into payment on retirement. The amount crystallises 20 times that P. It's worth noting that ancillary benefits therefore don't get tested. So death benefits, or if you've effectively got value from taking an unreduced early retirement pension, that doesn't get tested. So the example on my slide, if your pension is £10,000 and your LTA was 1.3 million, then you would have used just over 30% of your lifetime allowance. Second BCE to think about is BCE6, and that's a lump sum which is paid to a member on retirement, so typically PCLS, and the amount crystallised is just the amount of the lump sum payable. And finally, the third BCE that we're going to mention is a BCE3. That can arise when a pension in payment is increased. Now, potentially every time a pension is increased in payment, it needs to be tested against a BCE3. But because this BCE only measures increases above a certain permitted amount, a permitted threshold, it's actually very unusual that normal indexation increases will ever trigger a BCE3. Potentially, it might be triggered for more atypical increases, such as, say, a step up at GMP age. And in all cases, the LTA usage is re-expressed, and this is quite important, as a percentage of the applicable LTA at that point. Okay, so what LTA issues do we have to consider in a GMP equalisation exercise? Well, I'm going to mention and then quite quickly set aside issues for deferred members. Now, for them, the shape of their future pension might well change from what it was expected to be. So the BCEs that arise are going to be calculated by reference to equalised pension amounts. There's not really any LTA complexity here. It's just that there will be different BCEs that arise. I'm just going to flag one point that I'm going to come back to at the end, however, in relation to tax protections. For pensioners, unfortunately, it's not quite so simple because adjustments are going to be made to a pension which is in payment. So the key questions we have to try and answer are, what BCEs are triggered if a pension which is already in payment is later adjusted? And how might that impact the calculation of LTA charges? Now, for this bit of the talk, we're not going to draw a distinction really between dual records and conversion. We know that even if you're converting a pension in payment, we still have to use the dual records approach to adjust the pension that was in payment at the point of retirement. So we think the same or similar issues arise for both methodologies. Right, just in case you've been missing these lovely C2 diagrams, I thought it was useful to just give a quick reminder about what the shape of those adjustments might actually look like in practice. So this is a sort of C2, typical C2 shape. The man's unequalised pension is the blue line, the woman's unequalised pension is the pink line, and the sort of the GMP equalised pension is the green line. So that's what we're going to be adjusting to. So if trustees are adjusting a member's pension to that green line, what BCEs might arise? I think there are three possible characterizations that have been discussed. The first is a correction of the BCEs that arose on retirement. So in my example, you would go back to the point of retirement and you would recalculate the BCEs that should have arisen had you been paying that green line pension to the man from the beginning. So in my little example, I'm thinking about adjustment for the man. He had triggered a BCE based on a pension of 10,000 back in 2010. So that used up just over 11%. We're now going to go back. He's now got a pension of 10,500. So what we're going to do is we're going to recalculate that BCE2 back as at 2010. So that's going to be an increase in that BCE2, which takes it to about 11.16% of that LTA. The second approach is to effectively treat a new pension as coming into payment at the point you're making your adjustments. So you effectively look at what's happening at the point of equalisation itself, and you see what additional BCE2, what additional pension, what BCE might arise in relation to that. Now, in my example, let's assume we're doing that equalisation adjustment still at some point in that first segment, so before you get to a crossover point. So you're still going to increase the man's pension up to that green line. But because you're doing it a bit later, obviously the adjustment you're making is smaller than it would have been back at date of retirement. So in this example, I'm going to say the amount of increase is actually only £250 at that point. But because we're testing it now, say we've done our equalisation in 2020, we're testing it against a much lower 2020 LTA. So even though the additional pension measured at that point is smaller, because we're testing it against a much lower LTA, then you actually get a larger BCE in total for the adjusted pension. The third option that has been discussed is whether actually you still look at a current point in time, but you don't call it an extra pension, but you analyse it as a pension increase against a BC3. And that's obviously a much more permissive regime. Because of that permitted threshold, it might mean you don't actually have to have a BCE for all or any of the increase. But the problem with this option is we think it's very difficult to characterise something as an increase if it's happening at a point in time and when you also are saying I'm paying arrears in relation to what I'm doing. So we think an increase is something which happens for the first time at that point. So what has HMRC said in its guidance about what the correct approach should be for GMP equalisation adjustments? They've given very strong direction that the right approach is to treat this as a correction of the first BCE2. So on this slide, we've put out some of the implications of that approach compared to the second BCE2 approach. And I think in the context of equalisation, there are really quite strong justifications for taking this approach for this sort of adjustment. The first reason, and for me, I think this is the most compelling, is that this is the only approach that actually delivers equal tax treatment as between a man and a woman. So both a man and a woman are actually going to get the same green line entitlement. So it feels right that the tax and the LTA usage should be assessed in the same way as between a man and a woman. And you can only do that if you effectively go back to the point of retirement to recalculate the BCEs that arise. But there are some other advantages. One is that you get consistent tax treatment between deferred and pensioner members. And there's a timing point, another timing point aligned to this, is that under the second approach, if you're measuring the additional pension by reference to the adjustment you're making at that point when you're making it, then you can see quite quickly that the amount of BCE that is triggered could vary quite dramatically depending on when you get around to equalisation. And I think if that was the case, I can see all sorts of potential challenges for trustees around when they should have equalised in relation to the tax charges that arise. And I think if I was a trustee, I would be quite glad that the timing as to when I get round to equalise does not have an effect on the BCEs that arise. There is also a practical advantage. People who retired before A-Day won't have had a BCE calculated in relation to their pension. So that means this approach means there's no need to calculate or recalculate the BCE that might have arisen for them because there simply isn't a BCE to calculate. Although note that this could affect later BCEs that group have triggered, because those later BCEs, if they have had any post A-Day, do look at the amount of pension that you've already crystallised before A-Day. And finally, another important point is that this approach doesn't cut across other important tax protections which rely on a member having become entitled for tax purposes to all of their pension at the same time. Because effectively they are, you're just recalculating that entitlement. So that's something that is quite important for things like pension, keeping a pension protection age, which is less than 55. But there are some disadvantages compared to having a second BCE. The first, I guess, key disadvantage is that we think, especially looking at the second guidance from the revenue, which Catherine will talk about, that it's difficult to pay any additional PCLS. Obviously, trustees are going to have to notify all of their members who they're calculating the revised BCE and let them know of the new BCE2 amount. And the third, I guess, key disadvantage is it does become a lot messier to work out what LTA charges might have arisen. So let's look at LTA charges quite quickly. This approach, correcting the BCE2, does have some disadvantages here. If we're equalising a pension, and therefore we're increasing the BCEs that have arisen, then clearly it's possible that for some members, there could be new LTA charges that arise, especially if the extra BCE is what causes the member to trip over the LTA, or indeed if they were already over the LTA before equalisation is affected. Now there are probably two different, if you just go back a slide, Chris, there's probably two different approaches or options for schemes to consider. It might be that the revised BCEs in the scheme of equalisation are what takes the member above the LTA. But even more complicated is if it's the revised BCEs in the scheme of equalisation together with other BCEs that have already been triggered in other schemes, which actually are what takes the member above the LTA. Now, a LTA charge falls on the scheme in which the trigger BCE occurs, and that is the BCE. You have to line them up in order of crystallisation, and it's the last one that takes the member over the LTA. Now, clearly that's going to be easier to identify and manage if that trigger BCE is also in the equalising scheme. There's a lot more complexity if that trigger BCE actually is arising in a subsequent scheme and indeed has already occurred unknowingly. And the obvious point here is that second scheme won't know that an LTA charge was due, didn't know it was due at the time they put their benefits into payment, and they won't have any new benefits coming into payment from which they can deduct the LTA charge. So this does all become quite difficult quite quickly. There's going to be more guidance on this in the industry, past the guidance which is coming out. But although it is complex, perhaps just a word on proportionality. We've seen that the actual BCE adjustments are probably going to be quite small in relative terms. The cohort for whom that small increase in BCE actually triggers an LTA charge is going to be even smaller. And the circumstances where that charge is triggered in a scheme which is not doing the equalising, it's hopefully even smaller still. So it's a difficult issue, but hopefully will not affect that many members. So finally, before we move away from the LTA, a couple of other issues worth mentioning. Firstly, forfeiture. So if trustees do exercise forfeiture provisions, will this change the BCE assessment, particularly if they're not paying instalments of pension which were due at the point of retirement? Now, we think the better view is not, and that forfeiture is of instalments, not the pension entitlement itself. Obviously, we think forfeiture could change the future shape of the equalised pension, so potentially that might affect BCE3s that might arise or not arise, but we don't think it would affect the calculation of the BCE2. And that final point that I said I was going to come back to is whether the increased pension could assess the entitlement to tax protection. So members may have understated their assessment of the pension value they had at particular points in time when considering whether they were either entitled to or should apply for tax protection, or indeed the amount of the tax protection that they actually applied for. And in both cases, in HMRC's guidance, they effectively seem to be taking a relatively pragmatic approach and effectively saying, if you are affected by that, then the individual should notify HMRC as soon as they can to effectively make a late application for protection or get a protected amount.
Thank you, Susie. Now let's think about the annual allowance, and let's go back to basics initially. For defined benefits, which are the schemes we're talking about here, what the annual allowance measures is the annual increase in the value of benefit accrual, and we call those pension inputs, over pension input periods, which are currently tax years. And we're looking at P, as Susie explained to us earlier, the assumed rate of pension. It's really important to remember that we're doing something very artificial in the tax context. We wouldn't normally be trying to place a value on accrual year by year. And in doing this for annual allowance, we're using both a special tax concept of accrual and also the tax-specific method for valuing. And that's looking at that assumed rate of pension as though the member had reached normal retirement date at a particular point in time. So now's the time to really kind of disconnect your normal pension brains and put on your tax goggles and just remember we're dealing with these rather artificial concepts. It's helpful in this context to think about three different categories of members. So if we think first of all about members who left service before this new tax regime came into place on 6th April 2006, aka A-Day, so long as they don't start accruing in the tax sense benefits in the new regime, they stay outside the annual allowance regime. And Susie's just explained one of the consequences of that in the LTA context. It's great in the AA context too, they just stay outside. Then current actives. They're accruing benefits in every sense of the word. So it's no surprise that we measure accrual for them for AA purposes. And what we measure is the increase in P over the PIP. And we test that against the annual allowance, but after an inflation allowance for CPI, and that is a specified allowance, which refers back to the September in the previous tax year, so the CPI rate in the previous tax year, September. We then capitalise that excess using a multiple of 16, and that's what's then tested against the annual allowance. So our final group is people who left service on or after 6th April 2006. Now, there is a potential safe haven for this group, and it's known as the Deferred Member Carve-out, or DMCO. And if a member falls within that, then their pension input is 0 for that particular pension input period. So it's tested, you have to think about it each pension input period. However, if it doesn't apply, you then have to push the deferred through that same valuation test as you would have done for an active. And it just gets a lot more complicated once you start looking at deferreds. So it's not a great result to end up there. So the DMCO for post-8A deferreds is a really attractive place to end up. Who can qualify? The first point is the member has to be deferred in the tax sense for the PIP in question. So there mustn't be any arrangements for accrual of benefits for that member. And this is one of the places where HMRC take a view that may be a little counterintuitive. Where a member's left pensionable service but remains in employment and has any sorts of special terms, for example, special rates of revaluation, they're considered by the revenue to be accruing benefits for that arrangement, and so they're not deferred in tax terms. They can't benefit from the DMCO because they don't meet that first qualification test. From a tax perspective, in fact, they are active members. So that's the first gateway that you've got to get through. So the second condition looks at increases to members' benefits, but only to a part of them, to a part of the pension, and it's the part in excess of the GMP. And these are called the relevant rights. And these can increase, but only within tightly defined parameters or tramlines. And the reason for that is that HMRC didn't want to see the annual allowance avoided by schemes giving excessive rates of revaluation on deferred pensions. There are 3 different sets of tramlines that a member can fall within. The first 2 are rules-based. The first one is where the rules at a particular date had an RPI-related rate of increase. If that applies to a particular member, then they can fit within that limb of the permitted increases. There's then a second scheme rules rate, different date for any other sort of annual rate of increase in scheme rules. And then the final measure, which only applies if the member falls out of or is not within one of the scheme rules measures, is a CPI rate. And here it's possible there's some flexibility. It's possible for trustees to choose an annual rate of increase for a month from any month from the current PIPs. There's a little bit of flexibility around which measure is chosen. And in each instance, in addition to the permitted increases under the limb, you can add on the statutory increase percentage. Now, that add-on has to be solely attributable to the statutory measure in question, and importantly, it includes Section 67 of the Equality Act, which, by way of reminder, provides that a scheme that doesn't contain a sex equality rule is treated as including one, and under that, any term that's less favourable to a member of one sex than the comparator is modified so as to be not less favourable. Now, it's worth noting here that it's not always obvious how to apply this in practice. The statutory increase percentage was introduced in 2015 when we had a kind of a set of regs that sorted out a whole load of issues with the annual allowance with retrospective effect. And the reason that we had this change was because there were concerns that under the original formulation of these permitted increases, it was possible for something that was a purely statutory increase to take a member outside the DMCO. Now, it's rather oddly drafted, I would say, and on the face of it, it might allow for double counting in some circumstances, but that's not the way the revenue read it. They see it as just filling in where there's a problem with the statutory increases. So what happens if the DMCO doesn't apply in a particular PIP? Well, you then have to do that annual allowance annual calculation, and you have to calculate the P, and that is complex. And scheme administrators and benefit consultants tell us is really, in practice, very hard to do, and there's some really quite difficult technical points that come out. Outside the tax context, we wouldn't usually be thinking about revaluation until you get to retirement or another event like death or a transfer. The problem here is that in the annual allowance context, we have to artificially attribute revaluation under the scheme rules or statute as appropriate on an annualized basis as though the member had reached retirement. Now, one of the issues is that a number of these measures work on a cumulative basis. That's one problem. Another issue is that you get some really difficult, unintuitive results. So, for example, there's a timing mismatch. That AA inflationary CPI allowance I talked about earlier that's based on the previous tax year's September rate doesn't match up with statutory revaluation orders, which themselves have to be fed into these AA calculations. There can also be some very odd results that arise where scheme's own revaluation rules have caps and collars. So tricky. And also, of course, annual allowance is used up. Whereas if the DMCO applies, the pension input is zero. So the reason why administrators loved the DMCO is because it's complex to do the calculations. And I think members might be quite unpleasantly surprised if they suddenly find they're not within the DMCO. So now I'm going to start putting all of this into the GMP equalisation context. And I'm going to start with dual records because in this context, that's the easier gig. We're then going to move on to conversion, at which point Susie's going to pick up the baton for a while. I just note, I'm talking about dual records, B and C. And at this point in the party, we didn't look at this in Susie's graph, but at this point, as we understand it, there is effectively no difference between these methods at this point in time. The differentials start to arise once we reach retirement. So thinking back to our first slide, where Catherine reminded us about how those GMP inequalities start arising, these usually only start arising once a member becomes deferred. So for these purposes, we're not going to be talking about active members, just deferreds. When a member becomes a deferred, a member of one sex with the same service history as a member of the opposite sex will have at the start different GMPs, and therefore, as you go through the deferral journey with the a different slice of GMP in excess and different rates of revaluation being applied to each of them, as we go through the deferred member journey, we're going to start to see divergence and difference between a member and the opposite sex comparator. And when we equalise using dual records, what we're actually doing is topping up the slice of excess benefit over the GMP for the disadvantaged member and correcting in an upwards manner revaluation on that slice. So then when we start thinking about how that fits with the annual allowance, that requires us to look at P, which includes all the rights at the various calculation points. And here it's important to just remember that the right to equalise benefits for the effects of GMPs, although it was first recognised in the November 2018 Lloyd's judgment, that judgment confirmed an already existing right. So from an AA perspective, as the member went through their deferred member journey, that right and those equalisation uplifts should have been recognised and included at each calculation point. But of course, that hasn't happened in practice. So when equalisation does now take place, how should we analyse that from an annual allowance point of view? And I'll have the next slide, Chris, thanks. So the first question is, does the DMCO still apply? And we're talking here both about the year of equalisation and, in fact, prior PIPs as well. And the answer to that is yes, it does. So the first point is we have to make sure that this member has remained a deferred member, because that was the first condition for a DMCO. And here the analysis would be that what we're doing is adjusting revaluation, and there's some helpful guidance in the PTM that's quite long-standing that says that an adjustment to revaluation is not accrual in the revenue's eyes. The second question we have to ask ourselves is whether the equalisation adjustments are permitted increases. And again, we get a happy answer, yes, they are. Now, the guidance from the revenue states that the revenue accept that these revaluation adjustments are attributable solely to the application of Section 67 of the Equality Act, and so are within the relevant statutory increase percentage. The point there is that the revenue aren't concerned in taking that view as to whether or not there is or is not a sex equality rule in the scheme rules, which is a fairly broad brush view, I would say, of the legislation, but it does mean that we don't have to pass the particular fact pattern and the DMCO drafting in the Finance Act. HMRC are effectively saying that what they accept is that the equalisation exercise is within the add-on, the statutory increase percentage. If you do take a look under the bonnet and decide to do that passing, then my view is that there are reasonable to pretty good arguments for getting to this point. I think it fits reasonably well with the legislation as drafted. So, what about the other part of the guidance that comes right up at the front that says that the guidance applies when we're dealing with equalisation for benefit adjustments where the reason for the adjustment is solely for GMP equalisation. Again, that's quite helpful language. We know that in practice, where dual records methods are adopted, there may be a range of calculation solutions, and that's explored in some detail in the industry working group PASA guidance on data, a very helpful document. This approach from the revenue leaves scope for that reality that there's not actually going to be a single correct way to effect equalisation using a dual records method. So what about deferred members where the DMCO doesn't apply? So that's where we're already, schemes are already having to do annual allowance style calculations and valuations. Well, for those members, the calculations of P in the past will have been incorrect because they should have but did not reflect equalised benefits. And there's something helpful in the guidance here, because HMRC say that we don't have to revisit these for past PIPs. I think it's worth mentioning here that this view is not based on anything that I'm aware of in the legislation or the information regulations. So we are relying entirely on the newsletter for this particular approach to the past and not having to look at corrections. The revenue then go on to say, as one would expect, that in the PIP of equalisation, once you actually have kind of worked out where you are, you should include these equalised benefits in both the opening and closing calculations from that PIP onwards. And what about our pre-2006 deferred members? Well, they fall into the same bucket here as the other deferreds. We don't have accrual, which was the test that we were looking at for them as to whether they were within or without the AA regime. Adjusting revaluation isn't accrual, so they stay outside the annual allowance. And actually that guidance I pointed to at the top of the slide is guidance that's given in this context of the pre-2006 deferreds in a non-GMPE context. So what about fixed protection? Oh, sorry, before we get there, let's have our key takeaways for, sorry, Chris, we'll go back to our key takeaways. I've skipped. Okay, so our key takeaways for dual records for B and C. The DMCO is retained. Where there's no DMCO, trustees don't have to revisit calculations, but they should include equalised benefits in PIPs of equalisation and going forward. For fixed protection, it's usually retained. I can see we did need to be on the previous slide. Thank you, Chris. Can we go back to fixed protection, please? Okay. The best laid plans. So thinking about fixed protection for a minute and dual records before we get on to conversion. With fixed protection, what it enables you to do is to keep a previous lifetime allowance as the lifetime allowance is stepped down, so it grandfathers basically. It can be lost in various circumstances, but one of them is if there is benefit accrual. How is that policed? Through limits on increases, which are very similar to the DMCO rules, but there are some subtle differences which are worth noting. The first is that you test on a day-to-day basis, not just at the beginning and the end of PIPs. The second, more importantly, is that we look at all of P, not just the excess over GMPs. There's no concept of relevant rights in these tests. And the third relates to that statutory increase percentage. So where the revaluation is in line with scheme rules, so we're in a scheme rules lim of our permitted increases, just like the DMCO, we add on the statutory increase percentage. But where revaluation is in line with CPI, the statutory increase percentage is an alternative measure, not an add-on. And I have absolutely no idea why that is drafted differently, but it is. Now, where this lands us is that usually equalisation revaluation adjustments will be permitted increases for all the reasons we've just gone through with the DMCO, but there is one potential hard edge, and this isn't brought out in the HMRC guidance. And that is that if you've got fixed protection members where you're relying on that CPI lim, so for example, if that's been hard coded into their revaluation rights, because section 67 is part of an alternative measure, not an add-on, the numbers may work out in such a way that, or potentially work out in such a way that the members' fixed protection could be lost, but it will depend on exactly how this has been agreed with the member and what flexibilities there are in the drafting as to whether you end up with a problem or not. So it's a hard edge to be aware of, but it will be very fact dependent as to whether there's a problem or not. And Chris, I think we can skip over those key takeaways because I'll just say on fixed protection, it's usually retained. We've got that potential hard edge, and I'll hand over to Susie.
Thanks, Rowan. So I'm going to move on and look at conversion now in the context of annual allowance. And I think we have to just have a quick reminder of what is going on under the bonnet with conversion so we can understand how we might have to look at conversion when we put our tax goggles on and try and work out what's happening with the annual allowance. So key points on this slide. What is conversion? This is reshaping pre-1997 benefits by removing the GMP rules. So once you've converted, a member will not have a GMP and will not be subject to the GMP rules. Actuarial value, it has to have, the converted benefit has to have the same value as the higher of the man and woman's pre-conversion benefit. And what else might conversion involve? Well, it might involve a change to the P. It might involve a change to the revaluation rates that apply. It might change the increases in payments. It's worth remembering conversion allows any changes which are necessary or desirable as a consequence of or to facilitate GMP conversion. So how does this fit a conversion exercise with the annual allowance? So in the year of conversion, for AA purposes, at the start of that pension input period, we are still measuring the value of the pre-converted benefit, but it will still deemed to have been equalised on that dual records approach Rowan's just explained. So at the beginning of the PIP, we'll have that equalised benefit. It will have its own scheme and statutory and GMP increases. Then we convert. At the end of the PIP, we now have a post-converted pension that we have to measure using our valuation assumptions. And that post-converted pension may now have different revaluation increases. Now, if the DMCO applies, as you'll remember from what Rowan told us, the great thing is that we don't have to do these calculations. We know there is just an input of 0. So that is ideally where we would like to be. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves is whether there's anything about conversion compared to dual records, which means that if we're carrying out a conversion exercise, is there anything which means we can't keep the DMCO either in the year of conversion or in later years? So the way we're going to do this is we're going to interrogate our tax guru Rowan on the principles that she just explained to us for dual records, and how those principles might apply for conversion. And the first question I'm going to ask Rowan is, okay, so if we want to keep the DMCO, you explained that that first test, we had to ensure there wasn't any accrual. So reshaping that takes place for conversion, Rowan, could that cause the DMCO to be lost because we suddenly have accrual?
Well, I'd argue not, Susie. Even if you were going to reshape so that you hadn't increased that nominal pension P. And the reasoning would be that there's no benefit building up due to an employment link. There's no additional actuarial value being provided. And I think we've got some quite helpful HMRC ACA correspondence on pies, which would support that reasoning.
So that's great. You are going to remain a deferred member for tax purposes. So I've ticked off my first limb of the DMCO, and I guess for pre-6th of April deferred members, also fine. Right, my second question, what about that second limb of the DMCO, permitted increases? Will we stay within the tramlines?
I think we have a real problem here, Susie, because even if you're in a scenario where you're not doing anything to your P and changing it at all, we've got the issue that conversion involves GMP becoming non-GMP. So there's always going to be a jump in your relevant rights at the time of conversion. So if we take the example of a pension of £1,000 with a GMP of 200 and relevant rights of 800, the moment that you switch the GMP into non-GMP, your relevant rights are going to be 1,000. So that's inherent in the drafting, the current drafting of the legislation.
That gives me a grumpy face. With the dual records, you managed to wave this magic wand of Section 67 of the Equality Act to just make all these AA issues go away. Can't we do the same thing here?
Afraid not, Susie. It's really hard to see how it could help here because we're not modifying a less favourable terms as not to be less favourable. We're reshaping. And that's true whether we're reshaping and keeping P the same, or indeed if we're got any other sort of conversion design where we have an increase to P. The reason for what we're doing is a reshape, so doesn't help us. We do know that some consultants are suggesting that internal transfers might be a solution in this scenario. And my view on that is that the internal transfer technical analysis is challenging. If it did work, it only solves the annual allowance issue in the year of conversion. So it's a lot of technical thinking to do to solve a problem in 1 year only. Doesn't work for people with fixed protection. And it does raise some really difficult technical points around, for example, can conversion actually meet the technical requirements for a transfer? So there's some tricky issues there.
So if I am going to sum that up, can we keep the DMCO in the year of conversion? I think I'm quite sad because I think it's looking quite tricky. Clearly, if we're going to increase the P, then we haven't kept it. And it sounds like even if we're keeping the rate of pension the same, we're going to lose the DMCO simply because at the beginning of the year, we have a GMP. At the end of the year, we don't. So we're going to have an increase in relevant rights, which is not going to fall within one of our limbs. All quite disappointing. Looks like I'm going to have to carry out those nasty AA calculations. But I think I've just accepted I'm going to have to pay the actuaries even more money to do that. But what I'm really worried about is whether conversion is going to cause any members to lose their fixed protection, because I'm going to get it completely in the neck if I manage to do that. So do I need to worry about the accrual and that jump in relevant rights for fixed protection?
And no, you don't, Susie. And the reason you don't is because they're part of those subtle differences in the permitted increases between DMCO and fixed protection. So fine there. But if your conversion design involves an increase to P, that likely will lose you FP at the time of conversion. And as we noticed earlier, we don't get any help from those statutory increase percentage add-ons.
Sorry, my turn to drill, Rowan, in relation to subsequent years. So I know a lot of schemes will be looking at trying to convert in a way that has a minimum impact on members' benefits. So they may look to convert the GMP into something that's called a synthetic GMP, that's an equal GMP between men and women, and hanging on to that GMP revaluation, which might even mean you don't have to increase P. Would that work, Rowan?
I think there's a real issue there, Catherine, because once the GMP rules no longer apply, there's no obvious way to continue giving GMP style revaluation increases within those very strict tramlines we've looked at already for the DMCO and fixed protection. You're no longer going to be giving those increases because you have to under statute. So you won't be within the statutory increase percentage, and it's highly unlikely you'll have scheme rules that help you either. And you know, the fallback is the PPI bit measure, but we're likely to be exceeding that by giving these sorts of increases. So I think there's going to be an issue all around there.
Well, disappointing, but perhaps not surprising once something's not a GMP. Is there anything we can do to reshape so that we stay within the permitted revaluation constraints?
Well, one approach might be to link the whole pension to statutory or scheme revaluation to be within the tramlines we've been talking about. And because that revaluation is at a lower rate than GMP revaluation, a way to manage the fact that you're losing some value on revaluation might be to increase the rate of pension at conversion, so that you then target the same projected pension at retirement. We've seen already that if you have a jump in P, then you lose the DMCO, you lose the fixed protection. But the advantage of this would be that in the subsequent years, through the deferred member journey, then you could retain the DMCO. But got other issues to think about that are not to do with tax. You've got the issue of whether your pension at retirement will or will not align with the projected pension amount and how trustees feel about that. And then also, obviously, you have to think about other things like the death benefits will increase if you're increasing P. So some issues there.
Well, I haven't so far hit on a solution that would allow us not to have members lose their fixed protection. Is there a silver bullet that would allow fixed protection to be retained?
One design that I've heard mentioned where you might be able to retain fixed protection is to link the whole pension to statutory revaluation or scheme rules within the DMCO and fixed protection definition, and so within the permitted increases, not to uplift the pension at conversion, so you don't lose the fixed protection, but to deliver the value for those lost GMP style revaluation increases by increases on the pension once it comes into payment. So there you'd keep the fixed protection, the DMCO would be available after the year of conversion, but a bigger issue for the trustees because you're going to have real winners and losers here depending on longevity and other matters. And also the calculations would need to be bespoke for each member, although that may be acceptable in the fixed protection context because you're likely to have a limited cohort.
Thanks for those answers, Susie. Not always the answer, sorry, Rowan, not always the answers we want to hear, but nevertheless, good to know the answers. So the key takeaways then for conversion seem to me to be that there's no easy way through the tax issues and that members with fixed protection are really the particular problem. And as I said, I think a lot of schemes will be looking about an approach to retranche with synthetic GMPs. And one thought on that is, will administrators actually be ready to run all the AA calculations that would be necessary to deal with that for all the deferred members? I suspect they won't be keen on that if that's the solution. So I'll pause for breath for a second, and I'm now going to take us into the last segment of this talk, which is to talk about correcting lump sums that are underpaid in the past. Because of course we've been focusing so far on the underpaid pensions and correcting the original BCE2 to uplift the pension and all the implications of that. But there will also be a number of lump sums that will have been underpaid in the past. So I'll be focusing on the revenues guidance from July, which focused specifically on lump sums. And the 4 issues that they talked about in that guidance was lump sums that need to extinguish all of a member's rights, lump sums that have payment limits, lump sums that are only payable where the value of all of a member's benefits across all schemes don't exceed a threshold, and then some timing limits. So I'll look into each of those in a little bit of detail. So some lump sums have to extinguish all of a member's rights, and there are provisions in the pension tax manual where it quite rightly says that that's only rights which could reasonably have been known about at the time of payment. But I thought that might not help us much because we've known for years that the government thinks schemes should equalise GMPs. In 2012, they started consulting about changes to the legislation. And at the very least, we've known now for 2 years since the first Lloyd's judgment that we have to equalise GMPs. So it feels to me that at least since then, we reasonably have known about these additional liabilities. But here's where the revenue guidance is quite helpful. And they say that GMP equalisation rights were only reasonably known about when either the scheme administrator adopts the chosen GMP methodology or the schemes have chosen their method of equalising GMPs. Now, a little inconsistency in the guidance there, but I think as long as you go for the earlier of those 2 dates, that's probably reasonably safe. So what does that mean? Oh, sorry, no, we'll come to that later. So the next one was, no, that's fine, Chris, sorry. The next one is the payment limit. So this is the limit applies to the amount that can actually be paid at the point of payment. And the guidance says that additional payment now will not cause a lump sum paid in the past to be unauthorised. That's different from a limit on the value of a member's rights. And that's because some lump sums are only payable where the value of a member's rights across all their pension benefits don't exceed a particular amount. And of course, although the GMP equalisation uplift we only arguably knew about now, it was still a right, as Rowan and Susie have described, that existed all along. So those rights existed when the payment was made. So if a GMP equalisation uplift is required, there's a possibility that an original lump sum could be unauthorised. And the final one is lump sums that need to be paid within a prescribed period. And I think it's clear from the guidance that those prescribed periods do need to be met. So interestingly, go back. The guidance says whether or not a lump sum payment is authorised depends on whether the payment conditions that applied at the time of payment have been met. And this is arguably a slight inconsistency from what we've been talking about the extra BCE2, where we always go back to the original payment date and compare it with the conditions at that time. But for lump sums, and I think it's here because it's a slightly different thing because a pension is a continuing obligation, whereas these are lump sums that extinguish rights. So for lump sums, the revenue are saying that you look at the conditions now. So I'm going to look at each of the lump sums that tend to occur in practice. The first one is the small pension commutation, and these can be under either regulation or regulation 12 of the authorised payments regulations. And there are some usual conditions around meeting normal minimum pensions age, and for these the member has to be arm's length from the employer. But the ones that cause us potential difficulty are the ones in orange. So we've got the value of benefits under this and any related scheme do not exceed £10,000. And then we've got the one about extinguishing entitlement to benefits, which we now know is not a problem. So what does this mean for lump sums already paid? Are previous lump sums unauthorised? And the answer would be yes, if the GMP adjustment increases the value of benefits under this and a related scheme to exceed £10,000. But otherwise it would be no, provided of course that it's paid before the equalisation method is adopted or chosen. Can we pay a new one now? And we could do, as long as the adjustment doesn't increase the value of benefits under this and any related scheme to exceed £10,000, which could be difficult to know the answer to in practice. So then we have Regulation 12, and the key difference between Regulation 11 and 12 are, Regulation 12 applies where the scheme has 50 or more members. And in the guidance, the revenue interestingly say that they think most schemes with GMP will have more than 50 members, which I thought was an interesting conclusion, but I don't know where they came from. And the other important difference is there's the missing orange bullet about the requirement for the value of benefits between this and any related scheme being £10,000. So if we come on to the next slide, we'll see that helps the position. So this means previous lump sums are not unauthorised because we don't have to add the value of this top-up lump sum to the value of any lump sum paid in the past. And we can pay a new one now, again, assuming the payment will extinguish any rights we are now. So that's quite helpful. So I think it's worth focusing on the helpful points for these small pension commutation lump sums, because I suspect we will often make use of these when we're paying top-ups to lump sums, partly because they don't have to be paid to the member. Now, Susie quite rightly pointed out to me that our scheme rules won't necessarily be consistent with that, but it may be that we can amend the rules to allow these little lump sums to be paid if, for example, the member has deceased. There's no time limit for the payments. For schemes with more than 50 members, we don't have to worry about looking at the rights between this and other associated schemes. So as I say, I think this is going to be really helpful because my guess is the GMP equalisation top-up will often be worth much less than £10,000, so we'll be able to make use of this for our correction payments. Looking at the trivial commutation lump sum, again, the tricky bit's in orange. So we've got that same value point, that the value under all registered pension schemes is not more than the commutation limit, which of course is currently 30,000. And we have the timing issue. It has to be paid within the 12-month commutation period. And again, we're not worried about the extinguishes entitlements anymore. So looking at the questions we've been asking ourselves, are previous lump sums unauthorised? They will be if the adjustment increases the value under all registered pension schemes to more than the commutation limit. And otherwise it's fine, again, as long as it was paid before the equalisation method was adopted or chosen. But can we pay a new one now? No, we can't. Unless the original commutation payment was paid less than 12 months ago, so that we're within the commutation period, we can't pay a trivial commutation lump sum now. So if we had to pay a top-up, we'd pay it as a small lump sum. Serious ill health lump sums, these have less tricky aspects to them. Probably it's not in red, but the one about whether benefits are crystallized is the one that I find most difficult. If we go to the next slide, our previous lump sums unauthorized? No, they're not, because it didn't have any of the tricky issues around the value of rights, so that's fine. I'm a little less clear about whether you could pay one now, because I'm a little on the fence about whether benefits have been crystallized or not. But I think it doesn't really matter, because if they've not been crystallized, then you can pay an additional serious ill health lump sum. And if they have been crystallized, then you could pay an additional small lump sum, even if the member's alive. And of course, if the member has died, you could pay a small lump sum to a survivor instead. For completeness, I've included winding up lump sums. I think they're, well, usually will probably have been topped up at the time, and B, probably don't cause so much problems. So previous lump sums are not unauthorized, and you can pay a new one now if you're still in a position of wanting to be able to do that. So those are pretty straightforward. And the final one is the pension commencement lump sum. So again, the member has to have LTA available, so you go back, Chris. Not in red, but it does say the member becomes entitled in connection with becoming entitled to the relevant pension. And I think that's what makes this different from all the other lump sums, in addition to the timing limit of being paid no more than a year after they become entitled to it. So unlike all the other lump sums, okay, you can move on now. Unlike all the other lump sums, the entitlement here does arise back at the original BCE2. So the previous lump sums are not unauthorized, but you can't pay another one now because it has to be paid within 12 months of the commutation period. So unless the pension started within 12 months, then you can't pay one. But again, if you need to pay a top up, you could pay it as a small lump sum. So that was a bit of a whistle stop through quite a lot of issues. It's now 6:10, and I'm conscious we're overrunning. Obviously, feel free to drop off if you want to, and I see a few people have, but I think we're willing to stay on it for a few minutes just to pick up a couple of the questions that have come on. The first question that I think is for Susie, and I'm just going to read it straight out off the question. Regarding any newly identified LTA charges, which are now found to be due, where the scheme in which the trigger BCE occurs does not hold further uncrystallized benefits, so can't deduct the LTA charge at the point of future crystallization. If the scheme rules permit this, would it be possible to deduct the amount owed from future installments of pension in the same way as would be done if previous overpayments of pension had been identified? So sorry, Susie, that's a lot to read, but if you follow the question, do you want to have a go at that?
Thanks, Catherine. Catherine has already broken the first rule, which is that we wouldn't ask each other the really difficult questions that people put on the chat. But I think the problem here is that we're thinking about who is actually paying the charge. So in the normal LTA context, when you have joint and several liability, there are different rules as to whether the trustees are going to pay the charge on behalf of the member or whether it's the member paying the charge. Now, clearly, if you're in a position where the charge has actually arisen in that second scheme, and there isn't a sort of new benefit crystallising where the trustees can deduct it before they pay to the member, then what you would be, I think, looking at doing, if you were going to try and deduct it at all from the member, is effectively you're not doing it as the trustee deducting it and paying it. You're effectively paying it on the member's behalf. And so there might be sort of a timing mismatch because you're looking at the rules for when the member needs to pay that tax, as opposed to when the trustees pay the tax. So that is quite a complicated issue. There might be options around that idea of trustees deducting it from the member and almost paying the tax for the member in that capacity rather than the trustees doing it through their trustee deduction. I think that's what the answer probably is.
And I'd add to that, Susie, that I think you can always pay tax early. So I know there's the timing mismatch between the trustee and the member, but you could meet the scheme's timing constraints, the quarterly constraints, pay ahead of the member self-assessment timings.
I'm going to now ask Rowan a question, which has been raised, which is that point about the two tests for keeping the DMCO. One, we can't have accrual, and two, we have to keep on a year-on-year increases within our tram lines. If we're going to do conversion and we're actually going to increase the actuarial value of the benefits post-conversion, does that cause us a problem with the DMCO? Because actually now we have accrual, and I guess potentially a problem as to whether we're still an active or a deferred member for tax purposes.
Well, Susie, another really hard question. I think there could be a problem there. I think that where actuarial value is being added, there could be an issue around no longer being a deferred, but I don't know the answer. That would be my instinctive response to it.
There's a couple of questions on here that are probably for me, so I'm happy just to read them out to myself. So one of them is, at what point will a scheme be deemed to have adopted or chosen its method of equalising benefits? That's a really good question, and we were debating that amongst ourselves, especially since the revenues use two different words. And I guess two things. I think a lot of schemes have either suspended paying many of these lump sums or have found a way to get comfortable that what they're doing is sort of good enough, if I can put it that way. So in that case, maybe it won't matter because it won't need to be a top up. But otherwise, if it was, I'll certainly be advising my clients to minute very, very clearly when they're going through their GMP equalisation journey that they haven't adopted it, so that they're still, considering the options, and that they minute very clearly when they've instructed their administrators to really go forward with a preferred approach. And a related question from the same questioner is about when you're revisiting historic trivial commutation lump sums to see whether they're still authorised, that you need to take into account adjustments made in other schemes. And that's quite right, and that's very much what Susie was talking about with the LTA. It's the similar issue. In practice, my guess is people won't actually do anything because they won't know about it. And I think a practice will grow up around members advising schemes where it's an issue for them. And I think there will be some suggestions in the industry guidance about how to do that in relation to lifetime allowance. And I think a similar approach will probably crop up in relation to TCLSs. But of course, in practice, it's only going to be an issue where you're quite close to the threshold, because I think for most people, we all expect these adjustments to be quite small.
I'm going to take a really easy question, which is whether a copy of our slides will be made available, and yes, they will. But to ask a more difficult question, which is, that's our fixed protection sort of design that keeps it within safe harbours, where we have to effectively keep the rate of pension the same, but only provide statutory revaluation. So we don't lose fixed protection in either the year of conversion or thereafter. And the question there is that something that you would do with member consent or not? Because obviously you will probably be treating members maybe differently from the conversion year design which you're applying to everyone else, and also potentially for the conversion design that would apply to the comparator if they didn't have fixed protection. I think from that sort of comparator point, I think you would be allowed to assume that both the male and female comparators had the same tax protection. But I think it probably would be quite sensible, wouldn't it, to give the member the choice whether they want to have conversion design A, which means they wouldn't keep their fixed protection. It might be they don't need their fixed protection, of course, or having a conversion design which reduces their starting rate of pension but keeps their fixed protection. But perhaps the third kind of challenge from the member could be, why are you trying to do conversion at all for me if it has the consequence of lowering my starting rate of pension or keeping my fixed protection? Trustees, I don't really think that's a great choice that you're offering me, and I think you should be doing something else, like dual records. Ryan, did you have any other?
Oh, that was a fantastic answer, Susie.
Well, one final question, which I think we'll take just because I think we all feel strongly about it, is, do the tax issues with conversion make it hard for trustees to agree to it? And I think we all think, yes, it does. Not just the tax issues, but the winners and losers issues too. I think conversion is going to be a lot more difficult than we all thought when it first was starting to be discussed in serious ways a few years ago. Susie and Rowan and I could talk about GMPs and tax all night, and actually we talked about them almost all weekend, and we're very, very sad geeks that way. But I think now that it's 6:15, we should probably let you all go, and we will be sharing the slides. And can I just say thanks to everyone who's attended and for your helpful questions and for joining us on this dark Monday evening. Thanks very much, and goodbye from us.